Imagine a time when there is no leadership, when each person decides what is right or wrong based solely on his or her own desires. A time when values crumble, compassion disappears, and God's people live as if God does not even exist. This is the backdrop to Judges 19:10, one of the darkest and most shocking chapters in the entire Bible. A text that, upon first reading, provokes disbelief, repulsion, sadness, and, at the same time, an urgent need to understand how the people of Israel, chosen by God, reached such a profound state of depravity. This chapter is not an isolated story. It is a stark portrait of a nation that had abandoned the ways of the Lord. After repeated cycles of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance, recounted throughout the book of Judges, we now see the final degeneration of a society where God had been cast aside. Judges 19 spares no detail. The text is not only shocking, it is intentionally disturbing. It is the story of a Levite, a religious man, who treats his concubine with more indifference than one would expect from someone who is supposed to represent holiness. It is the story of a nameless woman, brutally abused and discarded like an object. It is the story of an Israelite city, Gibeah, in the tribe of Benjamin, that becomes as wicked, if not more so, than Sodom. It is also the story of a hospitable father who makes an unthinkable proposal. And finally, it is the story of a people who wake up too late to realize how far they have strayed from God's will. But why is this chapter in the Bible? Why did God allow such a cruel episode to be preserved in the Holy Scriptures? Because Judges 19 is not just ancient history, it is a mirror, a timeless warning. When faith is replaced by self, when justice gives way to expediency, when spiritual leaders become insensitive, and when people ignore God's presence, darkness advances, without mercy. This introduction invites us to look at Judges 19 with attentive eyes, an open heart, and a sensitive spirit, not to feed on the horror, but to understand what happens when the light of truth is extinguished. In this chapter, we will walk through this narrative step by step, divided into 15 remarkable moments. Each part is a piece of a tragic, but necessary, puzzle so that we can understand the value of fidelity, divine justice, and the indispensable presence of God in a society. Brace yourself. The journey will be intense, uncomfortable, but transformative. A time without a king, when everyone does what they want. Judges 19:1. In those days there was no king in Israel. Judges 19:1. This phrase is not just a historical note. It is a powerful spiritual statement. It is the key that the biblical author uses repeatedly to show us the chaos that reigned in Israel at that time. A time when there was no central authority, no firm government, and no clear spiritual leadership. But more than the absence of a human king, this phrase reveals an even greater tragedy. The people had lost their sense of God's sovereignty. When God does not reign in the hearts of a nation, people, or individual, disorder is inevitable. The phrase, "there was no king," symbolizes the collapse of Israel's spiritual identity. They were called to be a holy nation, guided by the law of the Lord, but they had become a society that did whatever it pleased. And, as we will see in this chapter, this has devastating consequences. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a Levite living in the remote hill country of Ephraim took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Judges 19:1. We are soon introduced to the protagonist of the story, a Levite, someone who theoretically should be an example of spirituality, a servant of the temple, a representative of holiness among the people. However, the first detail that catches our attention is his relationship with a concubine, not a legitimate wife, but a woman of lower status, a type of secondary wife, common in the culture of the time, although far from God's ideal for marriage. Here we can already see the beginning of a breakdown in values. The union between the Levite and his concubine does not seem to be based on love or commitment, but on convenience. It is a relationship marked by emotional and spiritual distance, as we will see in the following verses. The coldness and lack of affection between them reveal that, even in religious figures, there was decadence. This first verse warns us, it is not enough to have a religious appearance if the heart is far from God. The Levite represents someone who still occupies a spiritual place but has lost his sense of purpose, no longer lives with fear, no longer acts with compassion. He is a reflection of what Israel has become, a people with traditions, but without intimacy with the Lord. In this first step of the story, we are challenged to look at ourselves and reflect, who is reigning in our hearts? Have we lived as if there were no king, as if God's will were something optional, negotiable? When the word ceases to be the basis, when leadership is absent, when relationships become utilitarian, decay begins to silently set in. And here, she is just getting started. A broken relationship, the putting away of the concubine. Judges 19:1-2. He took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah, but she became angry with him and left him and returned to her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah, where she stayed 4 months. Judges 19:1b-2. The story progresses and reveals more about the relationship between the Levite and his concubine. And what we see is not a story of love, but of rupture, abandonment, and silence. The text says that the woman was angry with him, or in some versions, was unfaithful to him, or left him. The exact translation of the Hebrew may vary, but what is clear is that there was a significant rift between them. Something happened that caused her to leave her home and return to her father's house. This estrangement is loaded with meaning. In a patriarchal and conservative society like Israel at the time, this woman's gesture was extreme. Returning to her father's house signified shame, weakness, or possibly a protest against mistreatment or neglect. Although the text does not go into detail, the silence speaks volumes. There is pain here, there is abandonment. There is a relationship marked by coldness. 4 months pass. 4 long months of silence, distance, and separation. The Levite does not go after her immediately. He waits, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of indifference, until finally he decides to seek her out. But is he moved by love, or simply to maintain his honor or restore his authority? This subtle moment in the text reveals a pattern that will be repeated in the following verses. Women are seen as negotiable pieces, and relationships are motivated more by interest than by genuine affection. But there is something even deeper. Here, the image of the Levite and his concubine also symbolizes the people of Israel themselves in relation to God. Just as the woman left home, Israel turned away from its God. It turned to other ways. It broke the covenant. And for a time, 4 months or 4 decades, it was far away, distant, wandering. The question this passage raises for us is, in our own relationships, with God, with others, what has distanced us? Indifference, coldness, pride, lack of dialogue, the absence of repentance. God is not pleased with cold faith, utilitarian relationships, or hardened hearts. The concubine left, but the real drama is that this was only the beginning of a much deeper fall. This second step invites us to pay attention to the first signs of separation, when something is no longer right, but there is still time to go back, to fix it, to love better. Ignoring these signs is opening the door to greater tragedies. the Levite will be reconciled, but with what intention? Judges 19:3. Then her husband got up and went after her to speak to her heart and bring her back. He had his servant and 2 donkeys with him. She welcomed him and brought him to her father's house. When the girl's father saw him, he was glad to welcome him. Judges 19. After 4 months of being away, the Levite finally decides to seek out his concubine. The text says that he has gone to speak to her heart, an expression that, at first glance, sounds like a gesture of reconciliation, an effort at restoration. But in light of the context of the chapter, this intention soon proves superficial. Let's take a closer look. The Levite is not going alone. He takes a servant and 2 donkeys. It is as if he is on a formal mission, almost like someone going to retrieve an object that belongs to him. There is an air of ownership in his attitude, rather than compassion. It is possible that he wants to re-establish his social status, since in that culture, losing a concubine could be seen as a sign of dishonor. Yet the concubine agrees to receive him. The text gives us no insight into her feelings, not even a single line of dialogue. Once again, she is silenced. And this is important to note. Throughout the entire chapter, she never speaks. She is led away, delivered, violated, discarded, and we have not a single word recorded from her mouth. It is a stark reminder of how the most wounded voices are often the least heard. The girl's father, on seeing the Levite, rejoices. Perhaps because he sees a chance for reconciliation. Perhaps because he feels relief in restoring his daughter's honor. He welcomes him with a party, trying to create an atmosphere of peace, as we will see in the following verses. But the question that hangs in the air is the Levite really interested in her heart? Or is he just recovering what he thinks is rightfully his? This passage confronts us with the difference between genuine reconciliation and phony reconciliation. Speaking to the heart requires humility, repentance, and a sincere desire for change. When we reach out to others just to fix what bothers us without truly restoring it, we are simply putting a varnish on a deep crack. And here's a personal and spiritual application. How often do we draw near to God only to get back what we lost, and not to truly restore our fellowship with Him? How often do we return to church, to prayer, to the Bible, but without brokenness only because of the consequences of our falling away? The Levite went after the concubine, but not everything that looks like reconciliation is, in fact, love, the hospitality of the girl's father. When kindness tries to postpone the inevitable. Judges 19:4-9. His father-in-law, the girl's father, detained him, and he stayed with him 3 days. They ate and drank and spent the night there. Judges 19:4. The reunion does not happen in a hurry. The Levite is received kindly, and the father of the concubine treats him with warm hospitality. The text shows that they ate, drank, and spent several days together, 3 days in all, which continued even longer. The father insists day after day that the Levite stay, as if he wanted to extend that moment of peace and harmony, as if, unconsciously, he were trying to postpone something that was about to happen. This part of the chapter is almost a break in the tension, a small oasis of family life with meals, rest, and conversations, something rare in the rest of the narrative. But this calm carries a subtle restlessness. With each passing day, the father-in-law insists, "Eat some more, stay another night, it's too late to travel." It seems like overzealousness, but isn't there also a certain fear, an intuition, an attempt to protect her daughter for one more day? This repetition has two important effects. It humanizes the girl's father. In a chapter dominated by cold attitudes, He is one of the few figures who acts with a minimum of care, concern, and human warmth. He tries to hold the Levite back, perhaps to assure him that everything is really okay. Perhaps to keep his daughter safe under his roof for a little longer. It creates an atmosphere of suspense. The narrative seems to push the reader forward, as if to say, something is about to happen. And it is, The father-in-law's insistence on extending the stay works as a kind of tragic omen, as if he knows, even if he doesn't understand, that something bad is coming. This passage prompts us to reflect on moments of pause in the midst of chaos. Sometimes God gives us opportunities to pause, to postpone rash decisions, to remain where there is safety and light. But we do not always recognize these pauses as deliverances. The Levite in a hurry will begin the journey back even as the day is already fading, a choice that will have catastrophic consequences. There is also a reminder here of the power of hospitality. In a hardened world, small gestures of welcome still have power. The father-in-law could not change everything, but he tried to protect what he could, in the way he knew how. The question this passage leaves us with is, are we sensitive to the pauses God places in our path? Are we discerning the Spirit's invitations to wait, reflect, and perhaps not leave yet, even when everything seems ready? Sometimes someone's insistence that we stay a little longer is God's voice saying, wait, it's not time to leave yet. The reluctant departure. When we decide to leave at the wrong time, Judges 19:10. But the man would not spend the night there, so he got up and went, and came to Jebus, that is Jerusalem, with his 2 donkeys loaded, his concubine, and his servant. Judges 19. After days of hospitality, insistence, and coexistence, the Levite makes a decision that will change the course of the entire story. He decides to leave at the end of the day. His father-in-law's insistence is no longer enough. His patience is at an end. The Levite wants to continue his journey, even though the daylight hours are already running out. This verse may seem like just root information, but it carries an immense symbolic and spiritual load. The rush that ignores the signs, the Levite gets up and leaves, not out of urgent need, but out of impatience. He has been invited to stay several times before. He has food, shelter, and company, but he chooses the path of haste and leaves at an unwise hour, with daylight fading. How many times have we also set out too early? How many decisions have we made in haste, ignoring the advice, warnings, and pauses that God places along the way? There is a silent danger in self-confidence disguised as determination. The decision to continue on a journey seemed firm, but it was in fact foolish. He takes his concubine with him. It is important to note who is with him: the servant, the donkeys, and the woman he had gone to fetch. She accompanies him silently. And this carries a weight. She goes with him, but not because she chose to, but because he took her. This image is powerful. A man in a hurry making bad decisions and carrying along someone vulnerable who will suffer the consequences of his choices. It is a clear warning. Our decisions do not affect only us. When we act outside of God's timing, we drag those under our care with us, and often they are the ones who are most affected. Darkness approaches. They are heading towards Jebus, future Jerusalem, but they have not yet entered the city. They are on the brink of night, on the brink of tragedy. This is the last moment of normality before the moral darkness of the story takes over. The verse leaves us with a growing tension. The Levite thinks he is in control, but we will soon see that control is an illusion outside of God's direction. There are decisions that seem small, but are made outside of the light. There are decisions that seem simple, but are made at the wrong time. When we choose to follow our own impulses, without discerning God's timing, we end up putting ourselves and others on dangerous paths. The question that echoes here is, are you moving forward at the right time? Or are you insisting on moving forward even when God is saying, stay a little longer? Arrival near Jebus, preferring the city of God's people, but finding darkness. Judges 19:11-12. Now when they were near Jebus, it was late in the day. The servant said to his master, let us go to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night there. But his master replied, we will not go to any city of foreigners who are not of the Israelites. We will go to Gibeah. Judges 19:11-12. The journey progresses, and now the Levite and his small retinue are approaching Jebus, the city that would later be called Jerusalem. But at that time, it was still inhabited by the Jebusites, a Canaanite people. Seeing that night is fast approaching, the Levite's servant suggests that they stop there to rest. The Levite's response is revealing. He says in essence, no, we will not stay with foreigners. We will seek a place among our own people. This decision, which at first glance seems prudent or even pious, will turn out to be deeply ironic. The Levite rejects the hospitality of a foreign people because he considers them unclean or unsafe, believing that he would be more protected among the Israelites. He chooses to go to Gibeah, a city in the tribe of Benjamin, his people, his community. But this choice will show that the appearance of holiness is not always a sign of safety. He will discover that even among God's people there can be wickedness as great as, or even worse than, that among foreigners, the false security of the right place. The Levite makes a very common mistake. He trusts in his name, in his tradition, in his external identity. He thinks that by being among Israelites, he will be in an environment of values and protection. But he forgets that spiritual identity is not limited to belonging to a religious group. It depends on living under God's guidance. Israel at that time was spiritually corrupt. Faith had been exchanged for moral anarchy. And what the Levite will encounter in Gibeah will be so repulsive that the entire chapter will serve as a warning cry to all the tribes of Israel. This passage invites us to reflect on the difference between being God's people and living as God's people. Not every environment that appears Christian is healthy. Not every community that bears the name of God walks in the light. Sometimes the worst evil is found precisely where we least expect it, within religious doors, under the cloaks of tradition. Have you been trusting only in appearances, in names, labels, institutions? Or have you sought true spiritual discernment to know where there really is life, light, security? The tragedy begins when we exchange the guidance of the Spirit for the logic of appearances. The Levite chose Gibeah because it seemed safer. But he did not know that there he would encounter the darkest night of his life. Arrival at Gibeah, a people without hospitality, a city without light, Judges 19:13-15. He said to his servant, let us go to one of these places and spend the night in Gibeah or Ramah. So they passed on and continued on their way. The sun set when they were near Gibeah, which belongs to the Benjamites. So they went there to spend the night. They went in and sat down in the town square, but no one invited them to come in and spend the night. Judges 19:13-15. Finally, after refusing to spend the night in Jebus, the Levite and his servant arrive at Gibeah, a city in the tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. There, among their own brothers, they are expected to find shelter, hospitality, and acceptance. But what they find is coldness, indifference, silence. They enter the city and sit in the square, a typical gesture of travelers waiting for an invitation. As was the custom in Hebrew culture, hospitality was not just a courtesy, it was a sacred obligation in Israel. Welcoming strangers was part of the moral and spiritual law of the people, but no one welcomes them. This omission speaks volumes. Gibeah, a city of Israelites, acts as if God is no longer there. The indifference of the residents is not just social. It is a sign of their lack of fear of God. They settle in the square, out in the open, vulnerable, exposed. The reader begins to realize that something is wrong. The city that should be a refuge reveals itself to be inhumane, selfish, and forgetful of its spiritual identity. The absence of hospitality is the harbinger of moral collapse. This is an important detail. Even before the horror happens, in the following verses, the text shows us that Gibeah has already lost its heart. The lack of hospitality is just the first indication that the city is not just spiritually asleep, it is morally dead. The Levite is among the people of God, but he finds himself alone. The servant is silent. The concubine is silent. They wait, but no one cares. How many times does this happen in our days? How many churches, communities, or families that bear the name of God have become like Gibeah? Cold, closed, indifferent to the pain of others? There are people today sitting in the squares of the world waiting for welcome, waiting for someone to say, "Come, come in, rest." And what they find is silence, closed doors, indifferent hearts. God's people are not called to be indifferent. Coldness is the first step towards corruption. Lack of hospitality is the breeding ground for violence. Before horror comes omission. Before the scream comes silence. The old traveler offers shelter. Kindness in the midst of decline. Judges 19:16-21. Now there was an old man coming in from the field in the evening. He was from the hill country of Ephraim, but he lived in Gibeah, whose inhabitants were Benjamites. When he looked up and saw the traveler in the square of the city, he asked, "Where are you going and where have you come from?" Judges 19:16. When all seems lost, when no one in Gibeah shows compassion, an elderly man appears on the scene. A stranger in the city, someone who, like the Levite, is also not from there. He is from Ephraim, from the same region as the Levite, and he lives in Gibeah, probably as a laborer or migrant. This man sees the Levite, his servant and his concubine sitting in the square, and approaches with a simple but powerful question: "Where are you going and where are you coming from?" This question is more than a gesture of curiosity. It is a human question, attentive, empathetic. He sees the weariness, he perceives the abandonment, and he cares enough to intervene. In a world that has become deaf to pain, this man still has ears. He still has a heart. The contrast between him and the city, while all of Gibeah ignores them, this stranger acts like a true Israelite. The law of the Lord says to welcome the stranger, protect the traveler, be merciful to the needy. And he does just that. The Levite said to him, "We are traveling from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote hill country of Ephraim, but no one has offered me shelter." Judges 19:18. These words are heavy. The Levite is among his people, but no one has welcomed him. And the old man, upon hearing this, immediately offers them shelter, food, and security. Then, the man brought them into his house and fed the donkeys. They washed their feet and ate and drank. Judges 19:21. This is an almost sacred moment, a pause for humanity in the midst of darkness. They wash their feet, a sign of rest and respect. They eat and drink, a sign of communion. Everything indicates that for a brief moment, evil has been postponed. But it is only a truce. The night advances, and with it, the worst will come. This old man shows us that it is possible to live God's values even in the midst of a corrupt culture. He has no position, no fame, no title, but he has compassion, and that makes him shine in a dark place. The corrupt city, when evil no longer hides. Judges 19:22. While they were making merry, the men of the city, sons of Belial, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They said to the old man who was the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house so that we may have fun with him." Judges 19:22. Night has fallen. Inside the house there is laughter, food, relief. But outside, evil is approaching like a violent storm. The text says that the men of the city, called sons of Belial, a phrase meaning worthless, wicked, corrupt men in the extreme, surround the house and demand that the visitor be handed over so that they may abuse him. Yes, that's exactly it. These men want to sexually assault the Levite. We are faced with one of the most horrific episodes in the Bible, the collective sin. This is not the act of one deviant individual. It is the action of several men, united in an act of brutality. The evil here is collective, blatant, shameless. They do not hide. They do not fear God. They do not respect the sanctity of hospitality nor the dignity of others. They become an inverted reflection of God's people, a counter-Israel, where morality has been subverted, where the sacred has been profaned. The perversion here is not just sexual, it is spiritual, social, human. And most disturbingly, this is happening inside Israel. These men are not Canaanites, they are not foreigners, they are Benjamites, members of one of the 12 tribes. The evil does not come from outside, it comes from within. The parallel with Sodom, this verse directly refers to Genesis 19, when the men of Sodom tried to do the same thing to the angels who were staying in Lot's house. But there is a brutal difference. In Sodom they were pagans. Here they are men from a city of God's people. It is as if the biblical author were saying, see what happens when Israel completely turns away from her God. She becomes as corrupt as the cities that were destroyed by divine judgment. This is a painful but necessary warning. Evil does not begin with extreme acts. It begins with omission, with coldness, with the abandonment of the truth. And when the presence of God is rejected, there are no limits to decadence. Today, in our modern contexts, this reality is still repeated, not exactly in the same acts, but in the same logic. Religious communities that tolerate abuse, leaders who silence the pain of the vulnerable, people who claim to be of God but live without fear, without love, without justice. The question this verse forces us to ask is, are we God's people in name only, or also in character, in practice, in essence? When evil no longer finds resistance, it stops hiding. And when this happens, God's judgment is not long in coming. A horrible proposal, when even the righteous lose their senses. Judges 19:23-24. Then the man who owned the house came out to them and said, "No, my brothers, do not do this wicked thing. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this wicked thing. Here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out. Humiliate them and do to them as you see fit, but do not do this wicked thing to this man." Judges 19:23-24. It is difficult to find words to describe the weight of this moment. The old host, who minutes before had shown himself kind and welcoming, now makes an inconceivable proposal. In his desperate attempt to protect the Levite, his guest, he offers his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine to the attackers. Yes, it's as absurd as it sounds. And this contradiction reveals a disturbing truth. Even those with good intentions can be deeply distorted by a corrupt culture. The collapse of discernment. The old man tries to uphold the code of honor of hospitality, a sacred rule in the ancient Near East, at any cost. In the logic of the time, handing a guest over to violence was an intolerable shame. But what does he do to solve this? He transfers the violence to those who are most vulnerable, to women. He wants to protect a man, but instead he gives away a daughter and a concubine. This is not just cowardice, it is a cruel portrayal of the mentality of that society, where women were not seen as people with full dignity, but as objects to be traded, discarded, used to preserve male honor. And here is one of the most painful points of the text. No one questions this proposal. The Levite does not protest. The old man does not hesitate. The women have no voice. Everything is distorted. Everything is upside down. This is the ultimate consequence of a nation that has rejected God's rule. Even the good are confused. Even those who try to do the right thing no longer know what is right. Standards are confused. The sense of justice has been swallowed up by the logic of survival in the macho, violent culture of the time. This passage challenges us to reflect on the concessions we make in the name of protecting what is most important. How often, in religious or family settings, is the important guest defended, while the vulnerable woman is sacrificed? How many times do leaders protect reputations and positions, but throw victims to the wolves? How many times is honor confused with omission? This text invites us to a profound confrontation with the structures that prioritize power, masculinity, and pride at the cost of innocent lives. The question that echoes here is, are we willing to defend what is right even if it costs us something? Or do we sacrifice the most fragile to preserve comfort and image? Right now, there are no heroes. There are only victims, and the tragedy is yet to happen. Let us then continue with one of the most painful and dark moments in the entire Bible. The concubine is given away, the price of cowardice and indifference. Judges 19:25. But the men would not listen to him. So he took his concubine and handed her over to them. And they abused her and violated her all night long until morning. At daybreak they left her. Judges 19:25 here. The horror reaches its peak. The old host's attempt to offer alternatives fails. The men of the city are not satisfied with words. They are seized by a violent and collective desire, driven by the deepest perversity. And what happens next is so brutal that the biblical text narrates it with a dry, direct tone, as if it were unable to even develop the paragraph, only to record the fact. The Levite who should have been his companion's protector, the man who had gone to speak to her heart days before, takes the concubine with his own hands and hands her over to the abusers. He doesn't fight. He doesn't resist. He doesn't try to run away. He doesn't offer himself in her place. He just hands it over. The silence that screams. We have no emotional reaction in the text. The Levite does not cry. He does not scream. He does not seem to be in agony. The Bible does not record a single word from him or her at this moment. But the silence screams. The woman, who was already secondary in his life, now becomes a living sacrifice of a corrupt system of values, where women are not protected, where religious leaders are negligent, where honor is a facade for cowardice, and where the people of God are unrecognizable. She is abused all night long, not by one man but by several. A gang rape in an Israelite city. And this is what Judges wants us to see. The abyss into which one falls when God ceases to be king. God silent? It is natural to ask, where is God in this story? Why doesn't he intervene? Why isn't there immediate judgment, fire from heaven, or an outstretched hand? The answer, as harsh as it may seem, is in the background of the entire book. God had already been rejected. His people had made repeated choices of independence, idolatry, and self-sufficiency. He had withdrawn his hand in judgment, and now what we see is humanity left to its own devices, to its worst. But the fact that God is silent does not mean that he is absent. This entire chapter is a denunciation, a mirror, a siren. It is as the Holy Spirit is shouting through this text. This is what happens when you turn your back on me. This verse is not just a record of the past, it is a cry for today. How many women today are still treated as disposable? How many religious leaders still stand idly by in the face of abuse? How many people are sacrificed for the sake of ego, image, or false peace? This moment is a call to never normalize horror. Never treat the suffering of others as inevitable. Never be silent Levites nor silent communities in the face of injustice. The concubine was handed over. She paid the price for a rotten system, but her story echoes to this day as a denunciation of all forms of violence, including the spiritual violence of those who should protect but remain silent. Let us continue then, with a passage brief in words but devastating in meaning. The death of the concubine, the silent end of one who was never heard. Judges 19:26-27. When it was morning, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, and she remained there until daylight. In the morning her master got up, opened the door of the house and went out to go. And behold, there was the woman, his concubine, fallen at the door of the house, with her hands on the doorpost. Judges 19:26-27. There is no soundtrack. There is no dialogue. There is no lamentation. The woman, after a whole night of abuse, drags herself to the door of the house where the Levite was, alone, wounded, empty. And there, she falls. The text says that she stayed there until daybreak, with her hands on the threshold, as if trying to enter, as if asking for help, as if she just wanted to be noticed. But no one saw her. No one picked her up. No one consoled her. She dies there, on the doorstep, between the inside and the outside, between abandonment and the house that didn't protect her. The image of tragedy, it is one of the most symbolic scenes in the entire Bible. A woman who was used, abused, and discarded. A husband who sleeps peacefully while she suffers. A home where there was food, parties, laughter, and where no one went out looking for it. A threshold, a door, as a limit between what could have been salvation and what was neglect. This closed door speaks of a closed community, of an indifferent faith, of a society that does not listen to the pain of the woman who screams in silence. In the morning his master got up to go on his way. These words in the following verse are almost unbearable. He gets up as if nothing had happened, as if he were simply going to continue with his life, and only then does he see her body, lying there like a forgotten burden. He does not cry. He does not kneel. He does not express grief. The concubine, who had no voice in life, dies without anyone mourning her. But the Bible recorded her story so that she would not be forgotten, and so that her death would become a prophetic cry against all forms of injustice, omission, and coldness. How many people are lying at the door of our indifference? How many voices are we allowing to die in silence? How many spiritual umrais have become tombs of people who just needed to be seen, welcomed, loved? The threshold of this house is the symbol of a dead faith, a faith that closes the door when it is needed most. The body of the concubine is a cry from heaven against everything that is inhuman, against every religion without compassion, against every omission that kills in silence. And the question this passage asks us is, where have we been while the vulnerable die at the doorstep? of our comfort? Next, we see a reaction that is as shocking as the previous events. Not because it is violent, but because it is cold, almost inhuman. The Levite's response: indifference that cuts more than the sword. Judges 19:28-29. He said to her, "Get up, let us go." But there was no answer. So he put her on the donkey, got up, and went home. When he came home, he took a knife and seized his concubine, cut her limb by limb into 12 pieces, and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel. Judges 19:28-29. There is no pain in the Levite's speech. There is no lament. There is no guilt. There is only a dry, direct command, as if waking someone to continue their journey. Get up, let's go. But she does not get up. She does not respond. She is dead. And yet he does not cry. He does not touch her tenderly. He does not despair. He simply places her on the donkey, like a burden, like a lifeless object, and he returns home. This reaction is as disturbing as the actions of the men in the city, because it reveals a completely hardened heart, a man who slept while his partner was raped, a man who gave her up, and who now, faced with her death, acts as if it were just another step on his journey. The final act. Cutting and spreading upon arriving home, the Levite cuts the concubine's body into 12 parts, and sends one part to each tribe of Israel. This gesture, as macabre as it may seem, has purpose and impact. In the culture of the time, this was a sign of radical urgency. It was a call of extreme urgency, a cry for all the people to rise up in outrage. The Levite wanted to force Israel to see the horror that had happened, and finally respond. But the way he does it is cruel, impersonal, almost political. He uses her body as an instrument for a cause. There is no mention of regret. There is no honor in her death. There is denunciation, but no compassion. He makes people see what happened, but he doesn't show his own guilt. This passage raises a hard and profound question. Are we treating people as instruments, as means to our goals, causes, or discourses? It is possible to raise the banner of justice without love. It is possible to denounce evil without taking responsibility. It is possible to cry out against violence and still keep a cold heart. The Levite becomes a symbol of those who denounce the system, but participate in it, of those who expose the sin of others, but do not see themselves as part of the tragedy, of those who point out the rot, but with blood-stained hands. The concubine's broken body is not just an indictment against Benjamin. It is an indictment against an entire people who have failed to protect the vulnerable, who have replaced compassion with convenience, and who have become accustomed to death as if it were routine. Let's conclude the outcome of a tragic narrative that finally awakens people to something that should never have been ignored. National outrage. When silence is broken too late. Judges 19:30. And everyone who saw it said, "Never has anything like this happened or been seen since the day the Israelites came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider this, take counsel and speak." Judges 19:30. The final scene is as shocking as it is unexpected. The 12 parts of the woman's body are delivered, one to each tribe of Israel. And as these parts arrive, the people begin to awaken. The text does not describe exactly what each person saw, but the collective reaction is immediate. We've never seen anything like this. This is unprecedented. We need to think. We need to speak. We need to act. The cry that finally wakes up the nation. It is tragic that only an extreme, bloody and grotesque gesture could shock Israel enough to shake them out of their apathy. After years of living in cycles of sin and oppression, the people are now faced with the ultimate consequences of their spiritual neglect. The woman whose name was never mentioned, who was never given a voice, who was ignored and sacrificed, now becomes the catalyst for a national movement, but not out of compassion, not because they cared about her in life, but because her death had become undeniable. This verse reveals how numb the people of Israel were, and how the tragedy had to be explicit, scandalous, unbearable, for someone to finally say, "This cannot go on. Consider this, take counsel, and speak." These three orders are profound. Consider, reflect. Do not overlook this. Take advice, talk. Find wisdom together. Speak, do not be silent. Break the silence. How many tragedies today are still crying out for God's people to wake up? How many cries of women, children, the poor, the wronged, are only heard when the pain has already turned into a corpse? This ending is an invitation and a warning. God calls us to consider, to counsel, and to speak, not when tragedy becomes scandal, but before death knocks on the door, before horror silences us again. Judges 19 ends on a cliffhanger. The people are shocked. A heavy silence hangs over Israel. Something must be done, and in the next chapter, they will respond. But the damage is already done. The pain has already been sown. The woman has already died, and the question remains, how long will God's people need to see blood to remember justice? A body divided, a nation on the brink of war. The chapter ends with a sense of urgency and tension in the air. The concubine's body parts have already been delivered. The people of Israel are in shock, and now something needs to happen. The mutilated body of that woman becomes the symbol of what Israel had become. A divided nation, cut into pieces, without heart, without unity, without direction. The Levite, although negligent and cruel, succeeded in provoking a reaction, but his gesture also exposes the desperation and spiritual bankruptcy of the leadership of the time. He did not seek a judge. He did not seek the elders. He did not take the case before God. He did what was right in his own eyes, just like everyone else in Israel was doing. And that's what makes Judges 19 so terribly timely. A portrait of moral disintegration throughout the chapter. We saw a Levite who abandons his spiritual mission, a nameless, voiceless, discarded concubine, a hospitable father but blind in the face of tragedy, a city in Israel acting like Sodom, a people who ignore the cries of others, until the violence becomes visual, incontestable, a severed body becoming the scream that finally breaks the silence. Judges 19 is not just a tragic story, it is a divine denunciation. Through this narrative, God is showing how far human beings can go when they reject His presence, His voice, and His will. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges 21:25, this verse, which appears at the end of the book, is the interpretive key to the entire chapter. Israel without a king is Israel without direction. And when God does not rule the heart, chaos takes the throne. In the next chapter, Israel finally rises up. But what should have been a quest for justice turns into civil war. The tribes come together to punish Benjamin, the tribe of the city of Gibeah. The desire for revenge takes over. And what began with one man's inaction ends in a bloody conflict between brothers. One woman's tragedy will lead to the collapse of an entire tribe. Judges 19 is not a story to be read in a hurry. It is to be felt. It is to disturb us. It is to force us to look at the spiritual, social, and moral structures that still today silence, discard, and violate the vulnerable. And it is also a call. May God's people no longer need to see blood to wake up. May we learn to listen before the cry. To protect before the loss, to love before it is too late.